For most of your life, you were told the Iroquois were a single ancient people who had always lived in the forests of upstate New York. Then a quiet lab in Pennsylvania pried open a 5,000-year-old box, and the story you were taught began crumbling from the inside. Before we go any further, if you have ever felt that an old story was hiding a deeper one, subscribe right now and turn on the bell. Because the truth waiting inside this one may quietly change the way you see American history for the rest of your days. The way most of us learned it, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, were always there. They lived in cedar longhouses beside the Finger Lakes. They grew corn, beans, and squash in the same sacred hills. They gathered in council under the great tree of peace. And somewhere around the year 1500, a man the early visitors called Hiawatha, working with a prophet known only as the Peacemaker, knit 5 warring nations into a single confederacy that would later leave the founding fathers of the United States staring at their own constitution in quiet embarrassment. That story still lives in our textbooks. It still lives in our museums. It still lives in our summer vacations to those quiet lakes. It feels complete. It feels finished. It feels carved in stone. But for a very long time now, just behind that story, anthropologists have been whispering something very different. And most of us were never invited to listen. Because buried deep in the soil of the Northeast, written into fragments of bone and in the dust of cold ancient hearths, there is another history waiting to be told. But for a very long time now, just behind that story, anthropologists have been whispering something very different. And most of us were never invited to listen, because buried deep in the soil of the Northeast, written into fragments of bone, and in the dust of cold ancient hearths, there is another history waiting to be told. It does not begin with Hiawatha. It does not begin with European contact. It does not begin with any of the 5 nations we know by name. It begins thousands of years earlier, in a quiet moment when a small group of people, speaking a tongue nobody else could understand, began to grow where they had not grown before. And now, after decades of patient work, after thousands of careful DNA samples, after ancient teeth pulled from graves that the modern world had forgotten, the evidence is finally beginning to speak. And what it says is not at all what we were told. And now, after decades of patient work, after thousands of careful DNA samples, after ancient teeth pulled from graves that the modern world had forgotten, the evidence is finally beginning to speak. And what it says is not at all what we were told. Let me tell you what was hidden, and how carefully it was hidden, and the deeply human reason it matters so much today. For most of the 20th century, the comfortable story was simple. The Iroquois were always here. They evolved in place. They grew corn. They built villages. They formed a confederacy. And they greeted the Europeans as an old, established power. The bones of their ancestors seemed to confirm it. The Haudenosaunee of the 16th and 17th centuries were taller, broader, and better fed than their neighbors. Their villages were larger. The Haudenosaunee of the 16th and 17th centuries were taller, broader, and better fed than their neighbors. Their villages were larger. Their politics more sophisticated. Their oratory more disciplined. Their diplomatic traditions deeper. Their sense of law older. They felt ancient. They felt rooted. They felt like a forever people. Even the great historians of early America describe them as one of the oldest continuous civilizations on the eastern seaboard. But here is where the ground begins to tilt beneath that confident story. When scientists began looking at the actual genetics of the people living inside those grand longhouses, the picture started to wobble in a strange and stubborn way. In 2001, a researcher named Ripan Malhi, working with a small team of geneticists, collected mitochondrial DNA from living Haudenosaunee communities and from their closest Algonquian neighbors. Mitochondrial DNA is the kind of DNA that travels only from mother to child, like a tiny letter passed down through 1,000 grandmothers. What they expected was simple. The maternal lines of the Iroquois would gently fade into the maternal lines of the Algonquians, living all around them. That is what usually happens when 2 peoples live side by side for thousands of years. They mix, they merge, they blur into one another. But that is not what they found. The maternal lines of the Iroquois stood apart, distinct, almost separate, almost lonely, as if they had not slowly grown from the same forest for 10,000 years, but had arrived like a quiet new thread, woven into the same woods at a much later moment. Now, before we let a single study shake an entire forest, we have to be honest about what we still do not know. Some researchers interpret Malhi's data as a true long separation between 2 deep ancestral lines. Others interpret it as the signature of a small founding group expanding rapidly across a region they did not originally come from. A few still hold to the older in situ development idea that the Iroquois evolved directly out of the local Point Peninsula culture that had inhabited the same Great Lakes region for 1,000 years before any Iroquois name ever appeared on a map drawn by outsiders. The geneticists themselves are still arguing about the best way to translate these old biological letters into a complete human story. And this is part of why the deeper history is still alive. If you have ever felt that the version of history you grew up with was quietly missing chapters, just type the word missing in the comments. One word. That is all I am asking. Because what we are uncovering about the Iroquois is not an isolated footnote in some dusty academic journal. It is one example of a much larger, much quieter rewrite of the American past. And your single quiet word might be the first sentence of a conversation you have been waiting your whole life to have. Now, let us turn to the part most people never hear about at all. Long before the first Europeans set foot on the eastern shore, a quiet and almost unbelievable discovery had already been hiding in the languages of two peoples who were never supposed to be related. The Cherokee, living deep in the southern Appalachians, and the Iroquois, living in the cold lakes country of New York and Ontario, spoke languages that sounded absolutely nothing alike. Their word for water was different. Their word for fire was different. Their word for mother was different. Their word for sky was different. Their climates were different. Their foods were different. Their enemies were different. Their creation stories were different. Their ceremonial rhythms were different. Their music was different. By every visible cultural measure, they were complete strangers to one another. But in 1961, a linguist named Floyd Lounsbury sat down with thousands of common words from both language families and asked a remarkably simple question. How old is the divide between them? He used a method called glottochronology, a kind of careful counting of how fast languages naturally change over centuries, like a slow clock running through every generation. What he found was startling. Cherokee and the northern Iroquois tongues had been drifting apart for at least 3,500 years, and most likely closer to 3,800. That puts their last common mother tongue somewhere deep in the second millennium BCE, in an age closer to the building of the first Egyptian temples than to the Confederacy your history textbook loves to describe. Think about that for a second. Imagine discovering tomorrow that the people of Ireland and the people of Mongolia had once shared the same mother tongue 4,000 years ago. The Irish who sing Gaelic songs today and the Mongolians who ride horses across the endless steppe would have once spoken the same soft words around the same small fire. That is the scale of what Lounsbury quietly uncovered in the forests of his own language library, and almost nobody outside linguistics ever heard a word of it. More recent work has refined the picture even further. A modern glottochronological study applying the same careful counting. A modern glottochronological study applying the same careful counting to an even wider set of cognates places Proto-Iroquoian itself at roughly 26-24 BCE. And the geography. The academic study strongly suggests points toward the Finger Lakes region of west central New York as the original homeland of that mother tongue. In other words, before the Haudenosaunee Confederacy ever existed, before Hiawatha, before the Peacemaker, before any of the 6 nations we know by name, there was a small, quiet language community living somewhere among those deep glacial lakes of New York. And from that one small community, 2 great migrations would eventually begin. One went north and west, the other went south. The southern journey would carry those ancient words all the way into the southern Appalachians, where they would slowly, patiently, over many centuries, become Cherokee. So here's the mystery that should keep you quietly turning the question over in your mind for days. Why would a single language, born in one small place, split so completely that its 2 daughters ended up nearly 1,000 miles apart, recognized by early Europeans as 2 totally different peoples? What happened along the way? And why, in a country that loves to talk about its indigenous past, has the average American never been taught any of this? The archaeological record offers a clue, and it is not the gentle one you might expect. For nearly half a century, many archaeologists held a comforting view. They pointed to a culture called Point Peninsula, which inhabited the Great Lakes region from roughly 1000 BCE onward. Its pottery looked similar, its village patterns looked similar, its burial customs looked similar, its use of the bow and the hoe looked similar, its pipe styles looked similar. So the story went, the Iroquois were simply Point Peninsula grown up, no migration needed, no new arrivals needed, no surprise at all, just patient evolution in the same woods, generation after generation, into the powerful Confederacy the colonists would later describe. But by the 1980s and 1990s, that calm view began to crack. A researcher named Dean Snow spent years combing through the Iroquois archaeological record, comparing village sites, skeletal remains, and material culture across long stretches of time. His conclusions, published in the mid-1990s, suggested something more complicated. The northern Iroquois, he argued, may not have simply evolved in place after all. The cleaner explanation, supported by patterns of settlement and skeletal data, was migration. A new population moved in from somewhere else, blended with the locals over time, and gradually became what the Europeans would later call the Haudenosaunee. If you have ever doubted whether science can really rewrite a story people have believed for generations, sit with that discovery for a moment, pause, and let it land. More than 50 years of confident textbook certainty was replaced, not by a single dramatic find buried in a forgotten cave, but by years of careful, patient digging in old village sites that had already been walked over and walked over again. If this kind of quiet correction of the past moves you, share this video with someone in your life who insists that history is fixed and finished. Because the Iroquois story is the perfect example of how slowly the truth comes up out of the ground. And the genetic story does not end there, because when we look at the broader indigenous peoples of northeastern North America, the DNA keeps telling the same layered kind of truth. Studies of modern and ancient mitochondrial DNA across the Great Lakes in the Northeast have repeatedly shown that the maternal lines of Algonquian peoples and the maternal lines of Iroquoian peoples look meaningfully different. Some haplotypes appear more frequently in one group than the other. Some appear almost nowhere else. Even when they live in the same lakes and hills, in the same winters, and the same summers, the two peoples carry different grandmothers beneath their skin. The DNA is not a wall between them. It is a quiet river that runs alongside the other, sometimes crossing, sometimes holding its own course. A 2017 study by Jennifer Raff, looking at ancient DNA from the very northeastern edge of North America, added another piece to this slow-moving puzzle. Even in the far eastern regions, where we might expect simpler stories, the genetic record shows population complexity, movement, and mixture over many thousands of years. The picture is not a single neat arrow of one stable people holding one stable land. It is braided. It is layered, it is alive, and the honest academic tension is still unresolved. Take a breath here, because I want you to feel how important this is. Some scholars, building on Snow and others, argue that the archaeological and genetic evidence together suggest real movement of peoples into the Iroquoian heartland. Others still defend the older in situ model in modified form. The truth for now sits somewhere between both views, and the most responsible thing we can do as listeners is to hold that uncertainty gently without watering it down into something trivial. But if the Iroquois were partly newcomers to the forest, where we now imagine them as immemorial, then the deepest word we use for them takes on a richer meaning. The word native does not mean simply always here. It means made here. It means woven here. It means becoming here, patiently, over many centuries and many journeys. It means a people. Who arrived, who planted, who built, who prayed, who sang, who stayed. Now we need to add the strangest and most human layer of the whole story. The DNA work that promises to tell us who the Iroquois really were has, in many cases, been quietly turned away by the very people whose ancestors we are trying to understand. The Haudenosaunee are not just a subject to study. They are living nations. They hold their own citizenship laws. They decide who belongs and who does not. They maintain their own ceremonial life, their own languages, their own clan mothers, and their own sovereign governments. And when some scientists in academic centers have asked whether modern Haudenosaunee could be included in large genetic surveys tying them to ancient skeletons, the answer has often been short and quiet. No, this is not a small footnote. It is the beating heart of everything we are uncovering. The very same DNA science that promises to give us a fuller story has been shaped, slowed, and in some cases stopped by the very descendants of the people the science wants to study. Why? For reasons the documents themselves rarely spell out. Some nations feel that their identity is not something a laboratory should measure on a spreadsheet. Some nations feel that the bones of their ancestors should not be sampled without permission and should not be reburied in a museum drawer after a study is done. Some feel that academic curiosity has, too often in the past, walked across the graves of the people it claims to honor. So the truth we are uncovering is not some clean, lab-grown revelation handed down from above. It is a slow negotiation between science and sovereignty. It is a story of evidence gathering around an old identity, asking if the door will open just a crack so we can look inside. Some researchers respect that fully and keep working with older museum collections, with consented modern samples, with ancestors who gave permission long ago. Others are pushing forward, slowly, earning trust one generation at a time. If you have ever felt what it is like when someone wants to study you before they have ever asked your name, you already understand exactly what this feels like. And now the rarest piece enters the story. Because sometimes the rare exceptions tell us more than the common ones. In a small percentage of Native American mitochondrial lineages, stretching from the Great Lakes to the American Southwest, scientists have found a strange genetic marker called haplogroup X2A. It is rare. It is unusual. It is deeply puzzling. Most Native American maternal lines trace back to ancestors who crossed into the Americas from East Asia, roughly 15,000 years ago or more. But X2A behaves a little differently. It is not common anywhere in East Asia, It is not common in Siberia, and it has been found in ancient burials of Algonquian peoples from the Great Lakes region, sometimes at surprisingly high frequencies. For decades, a few bold researchers floated the idea that X2A might reflect some kind of very old contact with populations from Eurasia, even Ice Age Europe. The so-called Solutrean hypothesis made headlines. It was the kind of theory that attracted documentaries and whole best-selling books. And then it was carefully taken apart. Real geneticists walked. It was the kind of theory that attracted documentaries and whole best-selling books. And then it was carefully taken apart. Real geneticists walked. X2A behaves a little differently. Mutation by mutation anywhere in East Asia. Today, the working consensus is clear, and it has been found in ancient burials of Algonquian is most likely an ancient founding region of the Americas sometimes itself, surprisingly part of the very first genetic tide that for decades, a few bold researchers floated the idea that X2A the Solutrean hypothesis kind of very old survived the genetic testing it in Eurasia. Even Ice Age truth is still useful. The so-called Solutrean X2A was once thought to be potential proof. The kind of mysterious attracted documentaries and whole is now understood as proof of something else. And then it was carefully taken apart. The story of who real first came to this continent is far more layered, far more complex, far more ancient, and far more split between different founding lines than we ever dared to imagine. And the fact that X2A appears in ancient Algonquian burials of the Great Lakes region more than in ancient Iroquoian burials has become one more small clue in a quiet, growing case. The maternal lines of the Iroquois are not simply the maternal lines of the Algonquians around them, slightly rearranged over time. They are their own thread, their own quiet river, running a long time before any of our histories began to be told. Now, put it all together. Any of our histories began to be told. Now, put it all together. The Iroquois languages were a deep, shared family, with a southern sister language that nobody in the average history classroom ever expected to be sitting next door to it. Proto-Iroquoian itself appears to stretch back nearly 5,000 years, anchored in a small Finger Lakes homeland. Archaeological evidence suggests that the people who became the Haudenosaunee may have arrived in their later home through real migration, not through purely local evolution. Genetic markers show distinct maternal lines that do not quietly blend into the surrounding Algonquian populations. The DNA remains sparse for now. The debate is alive. Some scholars still defend in situ development in modified form, but the weight of the combined evidence is nudging the consensus towards something far more interesting than the old simple story. The Haudenosaunee were not a static, immemorial people simply waiting for Europeans to discover them in the 16th century. They were the living memory of a long, layered journey of language, of blood, of movement, of survival. The Six Nations we know today were the visible outcome of a story that was already thousands of years old before the first cedar longhouse was raised. Now we have to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Why does this matter to you, here, today, in a moment when you could simply walk away with a quiet, fun fact and never think about it again? It matters because every time we learn the deeper ancestry of a people, we quietly rewrite the moral weight of their present. For centuries, settlers, governments, missionaries, and even well-meaning textbooks treated the Haudenosaunee as if their story had only just begun, as if they were a small band whose timeline started the moment we noticed them, as if they were not ancient, as if they were not rooted so deeply that they were already 4,000 years old before any flagpole was raised over their fields, as if their culture was a museum piece instead of a living river pouring forward into the present. The deeper we look, the more respectable their history becomes, the more layered their identity becomes. The more clearly we see that we are not looking at a curiosity on the edge of American civilization. We are looking at one of the oldest continuous human stories on this continent, probably far older than our own. So here's the thought I want to leave you with, and please carry it past the end of this video into tomorrow and the day after that. We used to imagine that identity was something you could seal in a single jar and place on a museum shelf, a language, a single territory, a single bloodline, a single founding story. The Haudenosaunee quietly proved that idea wrong. Their identity is built from migration, from a 4,000-year language split, from a Cherokee sister nobody remembered, from rare ancient mtDNA markers hiding in close cousins, from a quiet Finger Lakes homeland, from oral tradition carried across 1,000 winters, from a great law of peace, from 16 generations of clan mothers, from a DNA record we are only beginning to read correctly. It is not one thing. It is many things, braided carefully together across nearly 5,000 years. And maybe that is the real gift of this story. Maybe the Iroquois are telling us, through ancient teeth and old pottery and rare haplogroups, that the deepest human identities are never single stories. They are long, braided rivers, and we are only now, slowly, learning how to read their banks. Before you go, take a quiet minute and ask yourself the next question. Whose deeper story do you wish your own country would finally admit you got wrong? Drop that answer in the comments, just one name, one people, one moment. The single name you type might be the beginning of a much longer conversation you have been waiting your whole life to have. And keep this final picture in mind as you scroll away. Somewhere in a museum case, somewhere in a quiet archive, somewhere in a clay pot pulled from a Finger Lakes field, there is still a fragment we have not yet read. A shard of DNA, a line of language, a line of bone, a faded corn kernel pressed into ancient soil. And one day, when a new generation of scientists and indigenous scholars sit down together in the spirit of consent and not conquest, that fragment may finally tell us who the Iroquois were before the Iroquois had a name. Watch this space. Because what we just uncovered today is only the first chapter of a much longer story, and you have just become a part of it.